our Politics and Prose community. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase Kat Chow's Seeing Ghosts and Nicole Chung's All You Can Ever Know on the Politics and Prose website. Additionally, you can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A button, which can be found on the bottom of your screens, and we will try to get to everyone's questions, but we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. Finally, we want to thank everyone for being here with us today. We're so thankful for our family of loyal customers and new friends for keeping our business and our spirits afloat, and especially to Kat Chow and Nicole Chung for taking the time out of their day to be here with us. If you haven't bought their books, buy them now. You will not read anything like that for the rest of the year. And so now I have the pleasure of introducing them. So Kat Chow is a reporter and writer. Her work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, The Cut, Radiolab, and The Sporkful. Her memoir, Seeing Ghosts, asks what it means to reclaim and tell your family's story. Is writing an exorcism, or is writing about death and exorcism, or is it its own form of preservation? The result is an extraordinary new contribution to the literature of the American family and a provocative and transformative meditation on who we become facing loss. Ocean Vaughn says, quote, like all books that haunt us long after reading, Seeing Ghosts is a courageous act of excavation and salvage. It is also a feat of rescue and healing. Tonight she'll be in conversation with Nicole Chung, author of the best-selling memoir, All You Can Ever Know. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, GQ, Time, Long Ranks, and Vulture, among others. And she also writes a weekly care and feeding advice column for Slate. She is the editor-in-chief of the National Magazine Award-winning Catapult Magazine and the former managing editor of The Toast. Please help me in welcoming them to Politics and Prose.
Woohoo! Thank you so much, Jessica. Congratulations again, Kat.
Thank you. It's feeling really good and very surreal.
That's awesome. I think you're going to start by reading a little bit for us, and then we'll go into our conversation.
Absolutely. So I am honored, first of all, to be speaking for Politics and Prose with you, Nicole. And I'm speaking to you from Politics and Prose's Union Market location. And the section that I'm going to read is toward the beginning of the book. And so much of this book is written in direct address to my mother. And I'll just jump right in. This image of you roaming and anxious stayed with me over the years, so much that sometimes I would discover you in your rigor mortis, softened slightly, appearing suddenly. There you were when I was 16, in one of the back seats of your minivan during my drives to school, supervising as I checked my blind spots before I switched lanes. There you were, trapped in the longest version of hide and seek, tucked behind one of the curtains in our living room, with your feet protruding from the bottom of the drapes, ready to leap out, laughing hysterically and shouting, "You found me," as I passed. I found you. Yes, I am always finding you. There you were, standing next to one of the garbage cans, with your face puckered in exasperation, as I sat on the stoop of my apartment in Brooklyn, having locked myself out yet again. Hello, I'd imagine myself saying each time, stifling a Jesus Christ, Mommy, so you wouldn't think I was ungrateful and didn't want you around. My family and I still referred to you as Mommy all these years later. I was unsure what type of reaction you expected. Your taxidermic self rarely talked, your presence itself seemingly a threat, like the monsters you invoked when my sisters and I were young. If you don't finish all the rice in your bowl, you used to tell me, the ginger ghost will come get you. In your seat at the kitchen table, you jerked your arms and shoulders and widened your eyes to mimic the zombie-like hopping movements of a gungsi, which you frequently told us tales about. Caroline had Boogaloo, Steph had Mulugatu. I had Ginger Ghost and Dracula and the Monkey King. They all had the same purpose, which was to instill shame and fear and punish us if we didn't listen. You were always assigning us new monsters to shape us into the daughters you wanted. Whenever you appeared in my life in your taxidermic state, I frantically reached for conversation. What doing? Van Maya, I spat out, borrowing from the way you greeted Caroline or Steph as they sat in their college dorm rooms and you stood in our kitchen, leaning against the counter and wondering over the phone if they were eating enough. But I knew each time I saw you that I hadn't brought you here just to catch up. I summoned you to remind me of the unfulfilled promises our family had made over the years, to appease your spirit and send you to the afterlife. Between you and me, I kind of liked having you around, even if memories of you appeared so vividly that I felt haunted. But then I'd shake my head and blink, and you'd have vanished. Thank you.
Thank you so much for reading that. It was really beautiful, and it's just really fun to get to hear you read from your book. I want to thank you for writing it too. I texted you about this. I spent a lot of Friday afternoon and also yesterday, just part of today, like rereading it after having read The Galley months ago. And it just hit very hard, honestly, and meant so much to me as someone who's been reading you for a long time, as a writer of memoir, and also as someone whose mother passed last year. Books are like written and rewritten, and I know this project was something you've been thinking about for a long time, even before you started working on it. We actually first met in 2015, and I remember, like in person, after knowing each other online, and I remember talking about these book projects, and now here we are talking about yours. So you're writing in Seeing Ghosts, obviously, about the loss of your mom, which was such a formative and devastating loss, and you were so young. But also, you touch on other deep, deep losses that you and other family members have experienced. And the impact of these is so clear, but I'm wondering, beyond sort of like memorialization and chronicling that, and probably helping people like me and people who have experienced similar losses feel less alone, like if there was really another driving question that compelled you to write this particular story.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I think that when I sat down, I always kind of knew that I wanted to write this book. I felt like in all turns of my career and in all turns of, you know, everything that I was doing leading up to this book, I felt as though I was always reaching toward writing about loss, whether it was about, someone else's family or even the loss of a country or a culture, and not just even grief over losing a specific person. Although that certainly was something that I felt like I needed to examine more closely. But when I decided that I was going to write this as a memoir and as a book, I knew that I didn't want this just to focus, of course, on my mom and her passing. While that is sort of the main catalyst for telling the story, I wanted to use the question of what do we owe? And what do we owe ourselves? What do we owe our families? What do we owe our senses of home and identity and, in a sense, culture? And coming up with that question was an interesting journey because I really didn't have that until maybe months into the writing process of actually writing what would become eventually Seeing Ghosts. And I was sitting down with a mentor from NPR, Keith Woods, who frequently would encourage me to write personal essays and read them and, just help me on the sentence level so much. And I was talking about a lot of these things and passages and showing him different chapters or what would become chapters. And he told me, it sounds like one of the questions you keep asking over and over again is, what do we owe? And I loved that. It just was so expansive. Really so that was really what I threaded throughout the book.
That's such an interesting question too. And it's something that I think even if memoirists aren't always keeping it in mind as they write the way you eventually did, it's when we're all asked to confront eventually, especially like as the book makes its way in the world. I wanted to follow up because you said something interesting, like when you decided to write it as a memoir. And I do remember your interest in fiction when and I don't want to assume it's past tense, but like I remember when we first met talking about books and like whether just your strong interest in writing like short stories and maybe a novel as well. So I guess my question is, was there ever a point at which you thought about writing this story, but telling it more through fiction? And then what made you decide, no, this is a memoir?
Yeah. I mean, that it was really interesting because I didn't realize that this is what I was doing in college, but in college, I was working on a novel that felt very autobiographical and actually used a lot of, or tried to do what this book was doing. I wanted to tell a ghost story, essentially, about an Asian American family where there was this daughter in search of trying to understand what her mother's death did in terms of to herself and her family, and how that reverberated. And I remember in college, I had two mentors, Sean Wong, who wrote Americanese and the novel Home Base, and Leilani Nishime, who is a professor of communications and Asian American studies. And I would always just go to them and I would show them these chapters of this novel, and it was a mess, and they would totally humor me and read this novel, which I think at one point I even shared with my family, and I think my dad read it. Shout out to my dad, who I know is watching this with some friends and family nearby. And I've just always been drawn to trying to tell this story and not always realizing that that's what I've been trying to do. So it's been really important. And I think a really grounding thing for me. In terms of that.
Let's talk a little bit about your mother and specifically how you wrote about her in this book, which you do so beautifully. Like, she comes to life so vividly, her warmth, her humor, her quirkiness, and just also her joy in being your mother. And as I read, I kept thinking how hard this must have been, and also maybe how rewarding in its own way too. And I think one of the hardest things to do as a memoirist is to see your loved ones, because we know them so well, like to see them as characters that we have to really treat that way to bring them to life so other people see them, because you can't just leave so many things unsaid, or readers will not understand, like they won't see your mother the way you did or do. So it's one of the toughest, but I think also it can be one of the most rewarding, like joyful parts of writing about your life. How did you approach kind of writing your mother in this book as a character? And also still, she's of course the person you knew and loved.
Yeah, this was hard. I mean, I thought going in that writing about my mom would be not easy, but straightforward in terms of she's someone who I've thought about so much. But I realized that, she passed when I was 13, and all of my memories of her are from the vantage point of a child. Mm-hmm. And that was really hard to reconcile with as a writer and as an adult, and at times kind of painful even, because it made me realize how much you can really never know someone in general, but especially not someone who has passed so long ago. And so as I was, interviewing family and interviewing some of her old friends and trying to remember her, one of the things that I understood was my mom was so funny. I mean, the passage I read, she had a really, macabre sense of humor. She was goofy. She was a little bit strange. She was not like a lot of other Chinese moms that I knew. She was always teasing, and I knew that was one of the ways I could really bring her to life, and that it would mean that I wouldn't just be writing about her in terms of her death, or her as a mother, or her as a sister or a wife. It would sort of allow her another dimension that I think was really crucial. Yeah. So it was important for me to write about how, when we were little and my family would go on these road trips to Maine, where we just were as a family, sometimes at, road stops, she would pull this prank on my sisters and me, where we would go into the bathroom stall.
Oh my God. This made me laugh so much.
I know. And she would sneak into the one right next to us. And then she would reach under the stall door and grab our legs. And I mean, like, that's a really scary thing as a little kid, but she would just find it so funny. And I really thought that her sense of humor was a way to make the book a little bit more playful, and also a way for me to sort of, I don't know, nod to a ghost aspect. I don't know. I mean, one of the things that she jokes about very early on in the book, this doesn't give anything away, is about how when she passed, eventually she wanted to be stuffed and put in my future apartment. I'm laughing because, I mean, anyone who knows my mom knows that that is exactly something that she would have said. It's a very strange thing to tell your child. And I actually remember I once told that story to an acquaintance who had asked me to get coffee because she was asking about what this book was about. And I told her the anecdote about my mom's requesting to be stuffed and put in my future apartment. And I'm pretty sure I had mentioned that it was a joke, but halfway through the story, I realized that my friend had a very confused look on her face. And she was kind of getting progressively more uncomfortable and like sort of, I don't know, maybe looking for the exit of the coffee shop. And then she finally said, "Wait, is your mom at your apartment now?" And you just, I mean, I think that just shows how, you know, presences can be larger than life. And so that was really important for me to channel the humor part of it.
I think you definitely succeeded in that in a lot of different sort of scenes and threads throughout. Like you, I think I'm obsessed with family lore and mythology and like those stories that really shape you. And I don't always mean the traumatic ones, although of course, like so often those do feel like the ones that at least spring forward in your memory and that you find yourself returning to over and over and writing and thinking, as you said that you did, starting, you know, from a young age. I'm also like really, I feel very convinced about this, that sort of questioning the stories we've always been told about people and events, like it's part of growing up, but it's also an essential step for anybody who wants to write like creative nonfiction about themselves. So I guess I'm wondering if that process like came naturally kind of to you as a reporter, the questioning, or if it was kind of scary for you trying to write a story like this, like for the public, when you talk about like what you owe, what were the obligations you felt, especially given that it did involve so much, I don't know, kind of questioning of this foundation that you were given.
I mean, I think it was an interesting thing because my family, just after my mom passed, it was so hard and we rarely spoke about her death. And so I think that it was necessary. Like, I think my reporting skills really helped me in terms of being able to ask these questions and to sort of be humbled by the answers that I was receiving. Mm-hmm. And knowing that I wasn't always right in these situations and that the points of view of my different family members, my dad, my sisters, my aunt, my uncle, those were their versions of what had happened and the lenses that they took. And I think one of the things that I'm most proud of in this book is the way I write about the uncertainty of knowing, and the way that I build these questions into the book itself, where I don't know, that phrase is a common refrain in the book, because I sort of wanted to leave that open, to show to the reader that even though this is a book that is about my family story, it is for sure not just one perspective, and that it is just, something that can change. Because I think that our understandings of a story or a person, or a life just shift over and over and over again.
I think those things change too, like as we do, right? Like as you live more and gain more perspective, it's just, not even necessarily like in your case, becoming a parent, if that ever happens, but like there's a ton of other ways that like as you age, your perspective will keep shifting for like any number of reasons, and it'll affect like how you view the past. And it's so funny because in a way, a memoir is always just it's not only like you are telling a very particular story. The events in the past don't change, but you change. And so like if you were to write this book 10 years from now, you know, it could be a very different book, not because the facts change, but because you do. Are there things that you learned, maybe some things that surprised you in the course of all this research and interviewing? And like maybe if there's something you learned like about yourself that surprised you, I'd be interested to hear that too.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, the most interesting fact that I learned was about, I mean, and this is not really about me, but it's about this man named Young Wing, who I found had lived and died in Hartford, Connecticut, where my family is from. And the fact of his life just blew me away. I mean, just the fact that it completely turned over my idea of what Hartford was like in the late 1800s or mid 1800s. Because he, you know, scholars love to say that he was the first Chinese American man to graduate from Yale in the 1800s. And growing up in Wethersfield, Connecticut, I just, you know, every time we went on a field trip, we would not be visiting the museums or houses of men like Young Wing. It'd be like Isaac Stevens or something like that. And so just learning about his life was really fascinating, and trying to connect that to sort of the situation around his death and his citizenship, which was actually revoked. And he lived in this period of Chinese exclusion, which I also found really interesting, when, you know, Chinese immigrants were technically not allowed into the United States because of immigration laws. But anyway, what I learned about myself was that I had wanted to write something book length for a really long time. And maybe this isn't the best, most mind-blowing thing, but for me, I was just stunned that I could do it, and that ultimately I would love it. I'm really proud of this book in a way that actually really surprises me, because I think often, I don't know if you're this way too, but I mean, often when I finish a project, I can think of a million ways that it could be better. But with this book right now, I love it so much, and I put everything into it, and I took so many career risks for it, and it feels really important that I did it.
Oh, I love that. And I'm glad that you're proud of it, and you should be. And I think it's so true that in a way you don't know if you can write a book until you write one. Like that's absolutely true. It's like you're sitting there writing a book proposal and you're like, is this a scam? Like, I don't know. I don't know if I can actually do it. So no, but I understand like kind of what you're saying. I do want to talk just a little bit more about the research, if that's okay, because I know you're a reporter, and like a great one, and still I was a little bit surprised by just the depth of the reporting and research that you brought to this book. And at the same time, like, I guess what I want to talk about, and forgive me, I'm kind of muddling my way into this question, but like on the one hand, you're able to interview people, and you have like records, and you've got like facts that, you know, you can sort of start to build a story with in different ways. But then there is so much room between what you can uncover through research, or like what you can remember yourself, and like a whole story that feels complete and like emotionally satisfying. So I just appreciated that you had to do so much bridging of those things, the research and the writing in this story, and acknowledging all those things you couldn't really know, which I always like in a book. Just from a craft standpoint, then, like, well, I'd love to know, one, like if there was any part of the book, and maybe this is where you want to talk about your family history in Cuba, maybe not, but like I was completely riveted by like those sections. Like if there's something that you just really loved writing, like the story of something, you know, that was really more based on research. And then also how you kind of approach those scenes where you're moving from what's known into what's not, and like kind of imagining what happened.
Yeah. It's interesting because one of my friends who read an early draft to this told me that there were, and I'm probably misremembering how she put it really well. Thank you, Allison, for this. But she basically said that she noticed that there were a few different perspectives and types of narrator that she was identifying. There was the sort of journalist cat who was more reported, and then there was also the narrator cat who was always questioning the facts that she was unearthing and sort of leaning into the uncertainty. And then there was a third version, I believe, of imagining a different sort of present, like where the ghosts come in. And balancing those voices was actually really hard. And I know your question's about research, but I found that in order for me to figure out a way to include all of the reporting and research, so about the Cuba section, where I sort of break away and talk about my grandfather, so my paternal grandfather, lived and passed in Cuba. And a few years ago, my sister Caroline and I went to Cuba with our father to try and look for these remains. And ultimately, my father was able to find them on a later trip. And Cuba is just such an interesting place because in general, I think a lot of people don't imagine or think about Chinese immigrants living there. And for me as a reporter, I knew that one of the things that I could understand was more about the history itself. There's this phenomenal book called Chinese Cubans by Kathy Lopez. And it is just a wonderful history of that community. And I read that so many times. I interviewed other scholars of Chinese sort of Caribbean studies, Chinese Cuban studies, and really it was just trying to use those skills to fill in gaps. And we were searching for my grandfather's remains, and I think it was, for me at least, I'll speak for myself, I was uncertain if we would ever be able to do it because, you know, sometimes there are certain things that you can never really unearth and you have to be okay with that. And so just trying to write into that research was really important to give myself an understanding of something that might ultimately not have an answer. Yeah, that was a really interesting challenge.
When you're writing about your family and sort of, and you did use your reporting skills too, in terms of even building the family narrative, you know, you don't just rely on your own memories. You also interview different family members, people who knew and also loved your mom. And still, I feel as though you had to do so much work to build the picture of her that's in this book, the character that we meet. And I guess I'm wondering, like, in those scenes, in those moments where, for all the facts that you've gathered, you don't have everything, like you do something, you do some speculative writing, like you imagine sort of how something was or how something would be if she had lived. And I found that those beautiful and moving. And I also am always so interested in it from a craft perspective.
Yeah.
Like when you are taking that extra imaginative leap, you know, how did that feel for you? Was it fun? Was it scary? You know, was it hard? I don't know.
Yeah, it was actually really comforting. One scene that I wrote about, that I am thinking about right now that I found really wonderful to imagine would have been an alternate last conversation with my mom or something of that nature, of being able to be reassured, or if she had, not passed, or her cancer, she had basically lived another year. And it was really painful, but I think it was important to have an alternate history. And I think that's why I loved creating this ghost device within the book. And I'll let the reader decide if the taxidermic ghost who I, invoke as my mom, if she's real or imagined. I want the reader to be able to make that choice. But for me, I found that really rewarding to write because it allowed me to sort of see her as still present, and still engage with her in that way.
You got to imagine a future.
Yeah.
Where you could actually share it. Yeah.
Yeah. I was talking with a really good friend the other day about seeing ghosts, and she basically asked this question. So in Chinese culture, there's a lot of talk of ancestor veneration and worship. And there's this point in the book where I'm speaking in direct address to my mom and I call her an ancestor, now an ancestor, or something like that. That's a line. And my friend asked me, at what point does someone become an ancestor? And I found that a really interesting question because I didn't know the answer. Still don't know, but I realized that in writing this book and also in just getting older and maybe more mature, I find myself gravitating toward the idea of ancestors more because it allows the person who is no longer there or alive to always kind of be a part of us. And they seem easier to access when you think of them or when I think of them that way. And I found that really helpful. And so being able to write in this imagined way sort of fit into this idea of how I orient myself now toward ancestors. So it was really freeing.
That's really beautiful. I mean, I also wanted to ask a little bit, you mentioned before how you took risks to write this book, which I love and really admire. And I guess I just would love to know a little bit more about like your process, because I feel like for as long as we've known each other, I don't have a lot of insight into like your process, and I would love to hear because I'm always kind of fascinated, like literally how do people write books? So like, what was that like? And I mean, like, how long does it take? And you went in with such a strong vision, like a really strong motivating question, like a driving question for this book. But that doesn't mean that like it's straightforward. It doesn't mean that you don't take twists and turns or that your approach might not change. So I guess I'm just curious to hear about your process and whether things did shift at all as you were writing in like surprising ways. Yeah.
Oh, it was a very stressful process.
Okay. Yeah.
One of my friends told me at the start of it that writing a book was like a series of trust falls where you just have to trust in yourself and then also your editor and other people around you to really help that book finish and make it, as great as it can be. But I started off just by writing about memories. And I think that's why memories are such a big part of this narrative and the ability to recall a memory and the ways that memories can just appear in your life so suddenly, like a ghost, so haunting. And I realized that I was having a lot of trouble writing a narrative that just flowed seamlessly. I was always wanting to bounce back and forth between time. And my process is, I would write really late at night. I'm a night owl. I would stay up sometimes till 4 or 5 in the morning and then sleep in. I was on sabbatical from my job at NPR and then eventually quit to work on this book full time. So it felt like there was so much pressure to finish it and not have to give back my advance and to not be ashamed, fail at something that I had really risked my career for, or it felt like that. That probably sounds really dramatic, but when you're,
it doesn't.
When you're on deadline, Can we just talk about how being on deadline for a book is the worst?
Yeah, I also didn't know deadlines were like remotely flexible at all, even if you had a very good reason. So like, I remember that being a lot. I not to make it about myself, but I don't think you're being dramatic at all. When people used to ask me what I wanted for my first book, I was being dead serious and not exaggerating when I said I wanted to not ruin my career. Like that for like a year and a half, maybe like while I wrote, that was the goal. So I get what you're saying.
Yeah. And you were writing while also working full time.
Yes.
That just seems like that must have required so much compartmentalization too on your part.
I think, yes, yes, it definitely did. I think also just having kids who were quite young at the time, it required a lot of different things, we'll say. I have very little memory of writing that book. I know I did, but like, I don't remember a lot of like long sessions. I'm interested that you said you wrote most of this like late at night, because I too am a night owl, but cannot write for beans like after midnight. I can revise, but I can't draft. So I do want to hear more though, like about your process and whether any part of it like surprised you or if it took, well, how did you figure out? So you said you were having some trouble with like the narrative, partly because you didn't want to write a linear narrative, which who does? So then how did you figure out, how did the book get into its current form? Because you definitely like nailed that narrative in the end. It's just not linear.
Yeah, thank you. I think it was when I realized, so actually in one draft of the book, everything was in direct address. And that was very early to my mom. And it was kind of a strange book in that iteration. Not a bad book, but there was something about it that felt so removed just because it just wasn't working for how I was writing it. And I realized that I needed to somehow pare back the ghost element. And I feel like it really came together when I wrote that first chapter. And I was able to sort of sum up the history that was relevant and find these parallels between my mom and me and my dad and me. And this idea of like losing your mother at a young age, which she did. And so once I was able to kind of identify that, I knew that this book would be sort of like a quest of this narrator trying to figure out and push and ask so many questions of her history and her family to try and reach some sense of whatever knowing about loss or what it is that we owe means. But it really took a lot of just, I mean, the reason why I like writing so late at night is because my brain just, all of the chatter that is in there just quiets because I'm so tired. And I think that's really necessary for me as someone who's quite anxious. And
Can relate.
yeah, and I mean, there was one moment where I went on a road trip by myself to Maine, where I had really some fond memories as a child. And I remember watching Fleabag, all the like, I think I rewatched it and maybe I watched all of the second season in one evening and stayed up till 3 a.m. and drank some wine and wrote some really hard scenes that I would then cut almost in its entirety, revise, rewrite, and that would somehow make it into the book as something much more coherent and still sort of unafraid and honest and hopefully tender. Yeah, so a lot of just trying to put myself in different situations to write too.
Let's talk about writing about just hard stuff and hard feelings, because you do a lot of that, which again is something I can sort of relate to. But like realizing how you feel and felt is one thing. It can be really tough to sort of write about it, for knowing that someone will eventually read it, or many people. Like, I guess I'm wondering if it's okay to ask, and you don't have to say if you'd rather not, please, but like, were there ways you managed to kind of take care of yourself when you needed to, when you were writing about these really hard things?
I would avoid writing about a lot of certain things. Like one of the last things that I think I wound up writing was about my mom's actual death, because it was so painful. And to have to sit back in that memory was, I just didn't know how to write about it because I didn't want it to be too raw. I mean, I really dislike that word when it's applied to memoirs too. I mean, so raw. I mean, because it's my life, but it's also a narrative and it's a story that I'm trying to tell as a writer because I'm paid to do it and it's my job and it's my, it's something that I see as a profession too. But one of the ways I really sort of grappled with that was by writing about how hard it was within the book and making that a part of the narrative. Like my instinct is to look away, but
Yeah.
what happens when I press and I force myself also to try and identify the feelings behind this loss. And I would often try and focus on one thing in each draft. So maybe in one, trying to remember one thing, I was like, what does everything sound like in this memory? And I would try and write those sound cues that I had into the chapter, or I would write about scent or something that related to the senses or how I felt in my body. Writing about the body was also really helpful, and the way we can sort of feel disassociated or not. That was surprisingly really grounding. Yeah.
Now that people have started to really read your book and you've gotten to talk with some readers, have there been any particular reactions that have really meant a lot to you?
I think honestly, it's people finding this book funny. That surprised me because when I was writing it, and I don't know if funny is the right word. I mean, it's a complicated book and it's a hard book, but I think that there is a lot of levity and a sort of dry sense of humor that I think for much of my life, I've always wondered if people knew that about me. Like, it's
for what it's worth, I've always known. So it comes through, I think, very clearly.
Yeah, it feels like my family's sense of humor. And so people writing about that or identifying that, I got a really lovely New York Times review that focused a lot on the taxidermy as mourning. And there was a line in the review that sort of mentioned the humor as it related to the taxidermy. And I was just so relieved that people saw this as something that had levity and wasn't necessarily like a scary or ominous type of thing. And so that's been really nice. And I actually have not so far. I mean, a lot of people are responding to the Cantonese too in this book. Because my Cantonese in real life is very bad. It's worse than my 3-year-old nephew's Cantonese. And he speaks Mandarin also. So,
well, like what a show off.
Yeah, I know, what a show off. Come on, you're making your 30-year-old aunt look really bad. But people it really, I think, resonated because, these readers had not before read many memoirs with Cantonese speakers. And yeah, that was something that I'd worked really hard on in the book too. I hired a editor named Jamie Chu, who is also a translator. And she took my romanization of Cantonese and turned it into something that was slightly more standardized. And that was actually a really cool process.
I'm going to ask one more question and then I'm going to go to the Q&A. So if you haven't had a chance yet, those of you in the audience, if you want to ask Kat a question, please do put it in the Q&A box and hopefully we'll get to it. My last question for now is just at the end of your book, and it's beautiful. And you're talking about how memory is love and survival and hope. And in the end, it's all we have. And, a memoir is built on memories. It's also in some way a preservation. And I also I picked up on that a lot during the taxidermy sections, just because, of course, that's also a very obvious sort of form of preservation, if you will. And it made me, every time that appeared, especially your mother and the ghost, it made me think about really so much of the work of this book is recovery and memory and preserving. Was that something you consciously thought about a lot as you wrote? And do you feel you accomplished it in the way that you hoped?
I do. I mean, I like to think of this book as my own version of our family's archives. And one of the things that one of my sisters said after she read this was just to the effect of having learned some new things about our family. And I wanted to make sure that I could preserve our family's history from my specific lens in this book. And I don't know, I think that's why I'm so drawn to reading memoirs in general, because it's often someone making sense of, something that happened in their life that's in a really specific way, but you're watching them kind of recover memory and build this archive. And I really love that idea. And I think that's why I tried to also make this book have a framework of the narrator, being very aware that she is trying to write this history. Yeah, that was one of the most important things in this book.
I think you really asked those questions and sort of filled that silence, that silence that you mentioned before.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
Oh.
I'm going to go to some questions now. The first is, how long did it take to finish a draft? How many drafts did you work through till the final? Another process question.
That's a good question and hard to answer because I'd been writing versions of this. I realized I wrote a little poetry collection in high school that I actually used to as research to go back and help with memories. And but really, okay, this most recent draft, probably since 2016, 2015, as a proposal that was then sold to my current publisher. But I sold the book in 2018, and that was when I really sat down and started trying to make these memories coherent and give it a very strong narrative arc. And as far as drafts, they kind of all blend together, but maybe there were 10, a dozen.
Okay. As a high school teacher, I was excited to hear you were working on novel and short stories in college. Were there any pieces of writing that your mother shared that inspired you? So I think like that your mother shared with you, and then what inspired you to write so young? I love a writer origin story.
Yeah. So I loved horses when I was really little, and my mom would, my whole family would always go to the library. And we would just check out so many books. My mom would read what she would call kissing books. And I would, there were times where I would just like read them behind her and I would just be so interested in the romance and have no idea what was going on. But she also would order me every single month these novels called The Saddle Club, which my sister Caroline would also read. And it was just things like that that instilled this love of books. And I think what helped me understand that I liked writing was very early on, even in elementary school, teachers would just tell me that I was good at it. And being a people pleaser, I was definitely like, oh, I'm good at this. So maybe this is something that I should just keep at. And I would, in sixth grade, for extra credit, read books and then write these book reports for my teacher. And I found that really fun. And I remember thinking at the time, like, I wish that there was a way I could do this as my job, and didn't realize that that's what cultural criticism is.
That's awesome. A similar sort of question, like, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
Ooh, try and write what you want, and figuring out your own writing voice versus what you think is publishable or what will sell is really important. And having this sense of what you want to explain, especially if you are a writer of color, or what you do not want to explain, and what your sort of parameters are, will help in so much of the process in terms of like what you will stand up for in your edits, or how you want your book to be framed, or how you want your, if you're writing essays or doing reported pieces, how you even pitch it too. And I have found that having that sense and sort of knowing what lens I'm writing from and how I want to talk about Asian Americans or immigrants or what have you, gives me, a lot of freedom when I'm writing and being edited.
Here's another question. It's about audience, and I will sort of add something to it myself. But the audience question is: were you thinking about families living with a relative with cancer as you wrote? And my question that I'm going to tack on to that very rudely is kind of just about audience and intent in general, I guess. Like, if not necessarily families dealing with cancer, like, were there other people you were very much thinking of?
It was hard for me to imagine a reader because I found that really stressful. I was like,
there's a certain point, at which you have to pretend no one will read it.
I was like, I don't want anybody to read this, right. Not even my editor. And my editor at one point joked that like getting this draft out of me and having me turn it into her was so difficult because I just kept being like, no, I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready. So it was, I wrote this trying not to imagine an audience, to be honest. But I mean, if I really thought about it, I think I was writing for children of immigrants, really.
Mhm.
And,
Yeah.
or, you know, children who are trying to understand parents, you know, and not necessarily anybody living with a terminal illness, but really just, yeah, for people who are trying to write and to understand it or have a better sense of something.
Yeah. I mean, I guess just following up on that, like, if I'm understanding correctly, you didn't really start writing, well, I mean, journalism. You were doing journalism in college. But like you really sort of came to like memoir and nonfiction a little bit later. Would you mind talking about like sort of that process too? You always loved writing and thought of yourself as good at it and loved it. But like at what stage did you start thinking, oh, like writing about myself, my life, my family, like that's important to me?
I think that writing has always been how I've made sense of things too. And feeling moved and wanting, yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I don't know if I can pinpoint that answer right now specifically when it happened, but I think I felt compelled to write about, you know, these things in my life because it helped me, putting them down on paper helped me just make them more real. And I found that it didn't feel too different than writing fiction. It still felt like very much you were working on a craft, you're trying to hone a narrative, and it felt like an interesting challenge too. Because how do I make sense of these facts of a life? And how do I turn that into something that is hopefully beautiful and challenging and provocative? And so I knew that I was ready to write this book after I felt really comfortable in my reporting and what my reporter voice was. To kind of go back to the question about advice for writers too, that was sort of, yeah, I think in around 2016 or 2017, really, I was like, I know who I am as a reporter and journalist, and I know how to ask questions of myself too, and to interrogate that.
For me, and having read a lot of your reported work as well, like I have noticed like there are similarities and then there are of course differences between like sort of your reporter voice and or like a voice that's more about cultural criticism, say, and then like the voices that we get in this memoir. For you, like I don't know, was it a challenge like moving from sort of what having done predominantly one to like focusing, especially after you left your job, like focusing on a different type of voice, or did they feel so close to you that it wasn't hard?
That's a great question. I mean, they felt so close. I think why I will miss writing this book so much is because I felt like I kind of built this world that felt comfortable and safe and also pushed me in a lot of ways. But I also felt like this was like what my writer voice was. And I could go into so many different directions in it because there's just this book touches so many things. It's reported, there's a little bit of cultural critique, but there's also just narrative and sort of like this imagined world too that I thought was so cool. And so like I think I will miss writing from that place. And I think all the work that I do in the future will be sort of searching for something like that. Yeah.
Another audience question is, has the writing of this book changed your inner dialogue, if you had one, with your mother?
Yes. And that I think it has allowed me to think about her with more closeness. I think before writing this book, even, I might have felt a little bit sheepish about like, you know, thinking directly toward my mother. I've never been one to pray, but the writing of this book it allowed me to be more vulnerable with that type of thing. And so, yeah, I think it's allowed me to do that in a way that I find really beautiful.
My last question, and I think our last question for the event, is going to wind up being, I like to end interviews with this sometimes. Is there anything we haven't talked about that I haven't asked you or that no one has asked you yet that you really want to talk about?
Oh, the books that I read to write this book.
Okay, that's great.
No one
you
has
mentioned,
asked that.
yeah, you mentioned some, but yeah, please, like just what, what was helpful?
I read a lot of memoirs. I mean, I read your memoir. I read Heartberries by Teresa Marie Malhat. There's this lovely memoir named Crux by Jean Guerrero, who's a journalist that I feel like deserves all of the recognition. It came out a few years ago, and it was just so beautiful. I read so many novels too, by a lot of Chinese American authors, and revisited much of what I read in college too. So a lot of novels, or a novel, Mona and the Promised Land by Gish Jen. And yeah, I don't know, I love books so much and I read constantly. And I am not one of those writers who has to stop reading while I'm writing my own thing, because I like having a lot of different voices bouncing around, because it feels so fun to just be writing in conversation with a bunch of other people.
Okay, I love it. I think that's like a fabulous way to end. And this
Thank you
was
so much.
No, thank you. This was so much fun. I loved it. Congratulations again. Everybody buy Seeing Ghosts. It is one of the most beautiful books I have read in years. Kat, this was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for tuning in.
Thank you, Politics and Prose. We could also just keep talking.
Keep talking.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Nikki. I really appreciated that. That was a delight.
Thank you. I had so much fun. It was wonderful. I'm so proud of you.
Oh, thank you for your close read of this book.
Oh my gosh, it was a pleasure. I mean, it's just so great too, like to have talked with you about this book for so long and then to like really get to see it. And I knew it was going to be good, but it just blew me away, Kat. So
Thank you. And thank you for blurbing it.
oh my gosh, you're welcome. I was honored. Okay. People are like slowly trickling out. I love that they get to hear this.
Okay, I am going to sign off now, but everyone, I hope you have a fantastic day.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Jessica.
Feel free to use the link in our bio to support Kat, Nicole, and PAP by purchasing their books, Seeing Ghosts and All You Can Ever Know. You can also check out our website for the most updated event listings. And thank you again for both for your time and for everyone watching. So stay strong, stay safe, and